everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Lara, adoptee, adoption wellbeing researcher, coach and psychotherapist. Today I'm talking to you all about the do's and the don'ts of relationships with adoptees. And I have for you today 6 do's and 6 don'ts. And this is the first video that I'm putting in both the adoption parenting playlist and also the playlist for adoptees, because as we are well aware, the patterns that we forge in our childhoods in terms of the relationships and how we relate to those around us, those are the roots for how we then later relate to others in relationship. So that's why I've put it in both playlists. If you are an adoptive parent, then obviously it will apply to you, but you might be having an adult, more intimate relationship with an adoptee, and so therefore these things also apply. And not just intimate relationships, although we do know that those are the relationships during which in adulthood our fiercest insecurities and deep-rooted fears and vulnerabilities play out, but very often some of our insecurities also play out in other relationships, both professional and personal, but to a lesser degree. It's absolutely within the most personal and intimate relationships we have and within the family that these patterns tend to play out the most. So that's why I've put it in both the adoption parenting and the adoptee playlist. So here are the 6 do's and the 6 don'ts, and I will be putting a brief summary of each one of them up on screen for you as we go through, just so that you can get a visual reminder of those. Here we go. Number 1, and one of those things that is absolutely crucial when you're in a relationship with an adoptee, is do what you say you're going to do. This is rule number 1. The issues of trust that come with relationships with adoptees are plenty. It's understandable that as we're dealing with unconscious processes around rejection, fear, abandonment, those kinds of things, we develop, again, an unconscious radar for the things around us that are trustworthy. There's a lot in the literature around trust with an adoptee. And one of the ways in which your relationship could be very damaged is if you are somebody who says you're going to do things and then doesn't do them. So just make sure that when you say you're going to do something, that you make sure that you do follow through on that. Because the adoptee in your life will be looking unconsciously, as I say, for evidence to support the idea that you are a trustworthy person. And no relationship with an adoptee can thrive unless there's trust for how they feel about the relationship. Without trust, most relationships would fail. Many would take a downward turn if there's no fundamental trust within the relationship. They're very hard to sustain. But for an adoptee, it becomes very much, as I say, on their radar. Make sure that you are doing what you say you're going to do. Own your part in any disagreement. Now, it's very natural and normal to have disagreements with people that you're in relationship with, any kind of relationship. Those disagreements are going to happen. But it's really vital that you own your part. An adoptee already feels somehow flawed, a little bit less than. An adoptee can feel as though they have, again, unconsciously done something terrible to deserve the punishment of being separated from their biological parent. And so what's vital in order for them to develop a healthy self-concept is that when you have disagreements with an adoptee, is that you own your part. Don't put all of the blame onto them, because this will just mean that the takeaway message for the adoptee is that they are flawed, that they will use that as evidence to support their idea that they are flawed, that they're less than, that they're not good enough. So own your part. And as with all of these things, it does take an emotionally mature person, it does take an emotionally grounded, secure person able to mentalize the experience of the adoptee to have a healthy relationship with an adoptee. Number 3, do reassure the adoptee in your life. It doesn't mean that you should be overbearing or smothering. adoptees can very quickly feel suffocated. We're not used to having the unconditional love. It doesn't come naturally, and it can be a very overwhelming experience. But what we do need is reassurance. Reassurance that you are there, that you understand what we're going through, and that reassurance is frequent. So do reassure frequently. Number 4 of the do list, do have patience. A colleague of mine in similar circles described the need to have nerves of steel. And I think that whether it's nerves of steel, whether it comes down to a secure sense of the self, a resilient sense of the self, I think all of these things are part of it. Maybe it is nerves of steel. We do put people in our lives into test situations without even trying, until we've dealt with the loss in our life, until we've come out of what many of my colleagues call the fog, before the adoptee is well aware of why the patterns in their lives are happening and has been able to work with them. We tend to be in what we call the fog, which is kind of a very dark, gloomy place of not understanding ourselves. And so in that place, we can put the people in our lives through the ringer and test them. We can put them into situations where they have to prove to us that we're worthy. That is something that happens a lot. So you are going to need a degree of resilience, patience, and understanding, and supporting your loved one through that journey. Number 5 on the do list is do encourage the adoptee in your life to be true to themselves. Again, because of the processes that we go through, the relinquishment, the abandonment, the sense of loss, and the ensuing fog that we have in our lives for many, many years. Many of us can end up just trying to fall in line. We become very good at being chameleons in the world. We'll fit in, we'll adapt to situations. And when that's happening in a healthy mindset, then that's quite a good social tool to have. But if it's happening because we are just trying to please people, we're trying not to be noticed, we're trying not to get too much attention on ourselves for fear of conflict or for fear of further rejection or further abandonment, then it's an unhealthy thing to do. So if you have an adoptee in your life who you care about, encourage them, gently encourage them to be true to who they are, to not be the people pleaser, to be authentic, to try and find out who they are, and then to live in that way. And then number 6 is encourage us to be boundaried. Encourage us to understand what feels right, what feels wrong, and to live through our boundaries. Now, in terms of living with boundaries, I work with a lot of people who don't have boundaries outside of the adoption space. And when we have no boundaries in our lives, then we can feel walked over, trampled over, taken for granted. And for an adoptee, that's particularly damaging, given the heaps of damaging thoughts that we already have about ourselves and about our place in the world. So the person in your life needs to be gently reminded that now that they know who they are, now that they understand what's right for them, let's say, through that sort of gentle encouragement to be themselves, that they are able to then find their voice, to communicate that to the people around them, to act with boundaries. And when we have boundaries in our lives, our self-esteem goes up, our sense of well-being goes up, we feel better about ourselves, and our confidence grows. So if there's one really important thing you can do for the person that you love who happens to be an adoptee, is to help them to find their own boundaries and to communicate those to the people around them. And now on to the list of 6 don'ts in relationship with adoptees. Don't make flippant promises. I guess that we all say things, and I think what's really important is that we become aware of what we're saying. So don't make promises that you feel like you might be able to fulfill, that you really want to fulfill in the moment that you're making the promise, but you don't know whether you can. If you're saying that you are going to do something, and again it goes back to the first one on the first list, so it's kind of the other side of the coin of it is, Don't make promises, even if you really mean that you want to do that. Don't make promises that you absolutely are not 100% sure that you can fulfill. You must manage the expectations of an adoptee. If you make a promise and that does not come to fruition, it can be very, very damaging to their self-concept and, of course, to the relationship. Now, what we understand about relationships is that those that feel the best are those where within the relationship we are made to feel good about ourselves. That's just a basic fundamental way, so it's not about heaping loads of praise on a person. It's about allowing that person to have the space to be themselves, but gently reassuring, as I've said, saying what you know to be true and not making promises that you don't intend to 100% keep. It's so vital that you don't make promises that you can't keep. Number 2, of course, there's going to be disagreement. Hopefully it wouldn't escalate into conflict. Let's have a look at some of the rules around open communication, staying present and trying to keep your emotion out of it. The emotions of an adoptee, especially while they're still dealing with all of the fallout from the loss and the trauma, are very fragile. And so it's really crucial that in the moment that escalates, that you neither threaten to leave, threaten to hand them back, or threaten to otherwise walk out in any way, shape or form, because that might be just something that you say in that moment, but to the adoptee, those words are absolutely going to cut to the bone. So don't make throwaway remarks like, I'm going to leave, I can't stand this, it's too much, I can't deal with you, I'm going to give you back, or any combination of any of those kinds of statements. Don't gaslight. Number 3, do not subject an adoptee to gaslighting behaviours. When an adoptee is expressing how they feel, it's not just made up, it's how they feel. They may need some support, they may need to talk it through, they may need to understand, but the feelings of an adoptee are there because something in their psyche, something in their emotional journey has given rise to those feelings. So gaslighting and making them question their past, making them question their feelings, making them question anything about the integrity in the relationship in terms of the way you view what they're saying is very, very, very damaging. So don't play emotional games, don't give them the silent treatment, and don't make them feel as though they're going mad for feeling the way that they feel. It will be hugely damaging. And again, I often say it's damaging in any relationship, but an adoptee has certain vulnerabilities, certain key bruised parts of their psyche that need to be looked after and tended to. And if you love that person, you'd be aware of that. So you wouldn't threaten to kick them out. You wouldn't threaten to walk out and say it's too difficult. That can be very, very damaging. And number 4, as a continuation to number 3, if there's a miscommunication, if there's a disagreement, I would hope, that you can have that conversation in a mindful way, that the emotions don't take over. But at the very, very least, don't withhold affection. It will just make your adoptee, the adoptee in your life, feel again that they are worthless, that they're not worthy of your love, they were never worthy of the parental love. And it will just chime in with all of those damaging self-concept thoughts that have been around really, first of all, as I say, unconsciously, and then later on as the adoptee begins to develop, questioning their right to love, questioning their right to happiness, questioning why that could happen to a person. I always say that some of the most burning questions that we have existing in this world don't have answers, and that's a very tough thing to come to terms with and to have to accept, and unfortunately we do just have to accept that. But on the journey to acceptance of why this happened to an adoptee, the worst thing that you can possibly do is to make them feel as though they're not worthy of your love by withholding affection, along with all the other things that you should never do with an adoptee in this video. If you're in a relationship with an adoptee, try to be somebody who is emotionally present. And if you are somebody who's emotionally present, resilient, all the attributes that it takes to be in a relationship with an adoptee, then you will hopefully not be a people pleaser. And number 5 on the list is don't model people pleasing behaviour, because that is something that adoptees very readily fall into in terms of a way of being. It's something that, as I mentioned in the do list, that we have this tendency towards a chameleon-like behaviour. We want to be accepted very often, certainly before we've gone through the process of understanding how we've been affected by our adoption. We want to be accepted. Very often adoptees are people pleaser types, and I think I mentioned in a previous video how we can put up with far too much very often in relationship, because we are that people pleaser, that we want to avoid conflict, we want to avoid rejection, further abandonment, and those kinds of things. So even if it's not in direct relationship with your adoptee in terms of your own people-pleasing behaviour, if you're modelling that, you need to become very aware of that, because the journey to freedom, emotional freedom for all of us, not just for adoptees, is to become very self-aware and to be true to yourself and to live your life in authentic ways and to not people please, because people pleasing is something that over time breeds resentment, and we can lose ourselves through that process. We can wake up one day and not understand who we are because we've lived our lives for other people. And so if you're in a relationship with an adoptee, it's vital that you demonstrate your own boundaries in the world, that you are not a people pleaser, and you're modelling very, very healthy behaviour if you can do that. And then finally, number 6 on the don't list is do not put onto the adoptee in your life expectations of how the relationship should be. Now, this is quite loaded. I think that because of the issues around the reasons why many people adopt, first and foremost, the desire to have a child very often does come into that. And so in that dynamic, the decision to adopt is very much about what you might be getting out of the relationship for yourself. And so that can lead to heaps of expectation that you are loading onto the adoptee in your life without even being aware of that. And so what's vital is that you give the adoptee in your life space to be, space to breathe, and space to decide how they want that relationship going forward. Understand that if you're an adoptive parent of an adoptee, the adoptee in your life does not have the genetic wiring to feel certain things just because. We know that happens with biological families, that there's a degree of feeling that is innate when we are biologically and genetically connected to, let's say, our mothers. This is why the mother is such an important part, fathers too, but this is why mothers are such an important part of our lives, and where a lot of these issues come from is because we know that people struggle to form separation from our biological mothers, even when they've put us through lots of pain. And my years of working with adults who were abused as children bears this out. It's very, very difficult to create that separation. But if you're not biologically connected to the adoptee in your life, then those feelings are not naturally, scientifically, biologically wired into them. And so what that means is that your relationship is going to have to grow very differently to that. And as I mentioned previously, the bond that you have and with the adopted person in your life is going to grow out of a sense of how good they feel about themselves, how validated they feel about themselves in your relationship. And if you can give them space to breathe, and if you can give them space to decide how they want the relationship to be, then that's going to mean the very best outcome for your relationship. If you try and imprint on them your expectation of the relationship, then you risk pushing them further away. You risk them being saddled with lots of guilt for feelings that they perhaps don't have. And after all, it's really vital to remember that the adopted person in your life, they had no power in this whole scenario. They had no choices. And they had to grow in full knowledge of the fact that their future was shaped and moulded by the decision that you took to adopt them. And yes, and as I've mentioned before, quite often the alternative might have been difficult, but we now know that the bond, the natural biological bond, by default is so strong. Yes, there are a myriad things that can break that can rupture that and disrupt it, but that's such an intrinsic part of being a human being. And that was removed by the decision to adopt. And whilst it's come from a great place, it's come from a place of the heart, what you need to remember is that you cannot force the shape of the relationship with your adoptee. And that goes also for relationships with adoptee and adult adoptees. Is you can't dictate how that needs to be. You need to allow the adoptee space to breathe, to be, to figure themselves out, whilst you're there gently reassuring, inviting them to open up to you and coming at it from a compassionate space. And if you can put yourself aside, I always say that in that way, that if you can put your own needs to one side for a while, then your relationship has the space to blossom and grow in the way that feels right for the adoptee. And unfortunately, it does need to feel, in the first instance, right for the adoptee. Otherwise, it can never work. I hope you have found these things helpful, useful. Please do link with me. My website is listed in the description part of the channel. If you have found this helpful or useful, then please do like, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your colleagues. And as I say, I will be putting this both in the adoption parenting playlist and the adoptee playlist, and there'll be more coming for the adoptee playlist as we go forward. All right, thank you for watching.